Hello, and welcome to our series where we are building a people and culture management system, or HCM, depending on your terminology. This series is brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie HR Solutions. And the purpose of this video series is although we are creating a people and culture management system primarily designed to bridge the gap between smaller companies who are scaling upward that may not have the resources to invest in a full blown HRIS, HCM, or PCM system with users and all that. We're really wanting to bridge that gap to give them something other than a spreadsheet or whatever it was that they were using prior to them scaling. Now, we're not taking you from start to finish, from scratch, so to speak, all the way to production. And the reason we're not doing that is because one, it would just take so long. But two, we have the vision that if we hit on small components and really isolate those components, like the create or populating these fields or doing these drop downs, writing buttons, things like that, then you'll be able to take those code snippets and what you learn and then create your own piece. So that's the reason why we're kind of doing it in a sort of mishmash way of major components instead of just start to finish. And plus, we would be here for years if we were doing that. So, in this video, what I would like to do is focus on two things really. The first is clearing. So, anytime we populate something in a field like this, we want to be able to clear it after it's run. And once we create a record and then we process it, we have that function here. We have that concept down here to where it clears this box. So it just sets this box to nothing. And we could, I suppose, go through all of these. Now we have over 80, I believe 79, somewhere around there, about 80 fields. So we could grab the ID of every one of these fields, or we can even do it through, I guess, a for each loop and cycle through and clear it all. Or we can use a method designed specifically for forms. Now, coming back over here to our operations page here, and if you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, or where we got all this, please go back and watch the previous videos where we started building this stuff out. So up to this point, this code or this UI was not under a form tag. If it was under a form tag, which it really is a form, read write, then we could do a little bit, we can do it a little bit differently to clear the entire thing. So what I've done was I came up here and I actually created a form tag and I called it records crud. And then I ended the forms tag right here, right after the button. And what this allows us to do is to use a specific method. And that method is called, let's see, reset, right here. So this last video, what I was talking about doing was replacing all the repetitive pieces that we were doing, particularly with our clearing, and putting it into its own function. That way we can just call that function. So that's what this function is, this reset record. And now that it's within a form tag, we are actually able to use this reset piece to clear everything. Now, reset goes through and sets all the field values to their default value. So if it didn't have a value, like you'll notice some of them have choose ... some of them have XXX as a placeholder. If it didn't have that, then it would just return it as blank. It would just make the field blank. But if it did have something, then it would reset back to that value. A good way to think about this is when you first open up a page what you see is what reset is going to produce. And this is helpful because you're not having to reset the entire page. You're not having to go through and write each and every single element and then change that back to default or clear it out. You don't have to do that. You just make it into a form and then just use this dot reset. Now, this dot reset only works on a form and it works on the entire form. That's why we had to give it an ID here. This record's CRUD. And it also doesn't essentially create things to false like we have our disabled pieces for our annual and hourly, both the pay and the field. So we have to add that in there. And then the same thing with the color. It just works on the values. So now we have this stored into a function. What we can do is call that function. And instead of doing this, which is that record action select, the button down there at the bottom and setting it to 0, what we could do is simply call this function. And you'll see that I've already started this for today's session, our read. We want to be able to read record and then pull it back. So now let's save this. Okay, it's saved. Let's go back to our form here. And let's refresh it. We'll come over here, open it back up. So what you see here is what it's going to reset to. So let's add in some stuff down here at the bottom, just so we don't have to scroll up. We'll do 25. They're not doing bad. How many shares you have? You have about 1,000 shares. And this would be 25,000, I guess. We'll just put notes in here. Okay, and now when we hit create, instead of it just being blank, it's going to return back to whatever value it was. So now when we hit process, it's going to run that code, that reset code. And as you see, it happens very quickly. Sets it back to nothing here because there's obviously no value, puts the X's back in here, and then sets this back to its original value of that choose action. So reset is pretty handy, and you'll notice that I already have a function built right here. So let's talk about this function. What we want to do is within our create, read, update, delete functionality of this piece, we want to be able to read or retrieve data. So I'm actually going to call this retrieve, not read. Let's call it read record right now, because then we can use retrieve when it comes back. And what we're going to want to do is we want to grab data from our sheet based on a unique identifier. And when we're thinking about employees, the last name is not a unique identifier. If you have a few employees, you're going to realize that you're going to run into individual employees with the same last name. Same with the first name. And we really don't want to be collecting social securities and having that pass around. I suppose we could do it by email, but typically we have a unique identifier already at our disposal, and that is the employee ID. So the thought here, we'd like to be able to grab this employee ID here and then store this in a variable, all here in our JavaScript. And then once somebody comes down, well, this is going to trigger it. Once somebody hits the retrieve record, it's going to go grab that employee ID in a function, store it in a variable, send that over to our Google Apps script side. And our Google Apps script side is going to want to come over to our sheet here and look at this column and then find that employee ID number. And then we'd like to return this row right here. And this row can then be passed back to our HTML side, our client side, And then we can populate each and every single little field with whatever value is corresponding. So this is going to come to us as an array. And we know that all we have to do with an array is just grab the index number. Now, one thing that's going to come up anytime that you read data and retrieve data from a site and bring it back, if we look at the formatting of all this in a Google Sheet, Google does something, it's beneficial, but it really creates a headache when you're trying to do what we're doing. If you look at the format of this, I'm not sure if it's populating up on your view here, but if you go to format, drop down to number and check the formatting of this thing, it's automatic. So Google is attempting to figure out what format is here. And then it does its best. So you'll look over and see this time with company. So this time with company, it's trying to take that and make it into a date. And at least this, the reason why I'm thinking is because it's surrounded by dates. Perhaps if a column adjacent to it is a date, it thinks that's a date. So we need to format that differently. So let's format this into a number, and let's format this into a number. And once we build out our retrieve functionality and we start getting data back, you'll notice that sometimes these don't come over correctly, or we're going to use index of, and if this number here is set to automatic, it's not going to pull it because it doesn't know what type it is. And when we think about kind of the same principle when we think about the equals versus two equals versus three equals, when we're doing a comparison, that one equal is essentially setting the value of something. The two equal signs is the value and the type, so number, boolean, string, or whatever. And then that third value is strictly, it's a strict comparison. Essentially, it is exactly what that is as a string. So when it's a lot like that, if it's coming to us and this is plain text, this is plain text, this is whatever Google thinks it is, it's going to come to us in a hodgepodge of ways. And really, Google is going to say, is this a number or is this a string? So what we're going to have to do when we finally build this out with index of is we'll have to look at our formatting. And there is a way that we can do this after we populate, after we create a record here, we can then just add another line of code to say, okay, this is how we want to actually format every one of these cells. And we'll do that towards the end here. But let's go ahead and jump into our building out our code here. So if you remember, we had this block of code way back when before we got coding like mad people here. That was based on that was based on those button selections. So wage type helper, and this is the helpful piece of keeping your code written like a book. So we know we have the clear wage fields. So it's right here. There we go. So this is this process action button. When that process action button is pushed, it runs this function here. And then it goes and grabs the value of that. And if it's create record, then it runs our create record. And if it's retrieve record, we want to run this function, this read record. And this read record is right here. So what we're going to need to do actually is we are going to want to send it over to our Google Apps script and then have our Google Apps script run and then send something back. So in order to do that, we are going to need to do Google script run. Let's get rid of this reset record. I was playing with reset record. That's the reason why that's there. I was trying to, quick explanation. I was trying to figure out which one was faster, reset record, or simply using something like this to grab all of our element by IDs and then just essentially using a for each to go through and set everything back to default. And I was trying to figure out which one of those was faster. And by far, if we wrap it in a form, reset record is much, much faster. And it's just less code. So that's the reason why that was there. But what we want to do is we want to store something in a variable first. So let's call a variable rec imp number. And then let's go back to our page and see if that's actually what it's called. If that's the ID of it. Employee ID. Oh, nope, it's rec employee ID. We'll just use that. And we want this to be equal to document get element by ID, and it's going to be rec amp ID. Okay. Now we don't want to get the value of that yet, because what I'd like to do is grab this, because when we read a record, we update a record, and we archive a record, what we're going to end up doing is using this employee ID a lot. So let's just come up here and store it in a global. So now we have that in a variable. And we can now call that variable to get the value. So let's call this variable, because this is going to be the variable that we pass over to our Google Apps script in the form of an argument for the function. So let's call it, let's just call it employee ID, just like that. Because that way, when we're reading it over in our Google Apps script, we know exactly what it is. And this is going to be rec imp ID dot value. So now we have it stored in a value. Let's go ahead and write Google script run. And we are going to want a success handler. And the script that we are going to want to run over in our Google Apps script side is going to be a function. And let's think of a name for that function. Let's call it retrieve. Because I believe our create, nope, okay, it's push record. Let's call it pull record. Just to keep it consistent, pull record. And the function that we're going to want to run here is, let's call this pop pull record. Because that way we know that the functions are essentially aligned. They kind of belong to each other. And this pull record will match this push record. So since we're here, let's go ahead and do function pull record that will be taking an argument, and it's not going to do anything right now. Okay, so now let's create this function also, this function pop pull record. And what we'll do is we'll just do an alert just to make sure that everything's connected. I am the pop pull record function. There we go. And what we're wanting to pass to this pull record over in our Google Apps script is that employee ID, the value of that field. And we stored that right here in our variable. So this is the variable that we need to pass to our Google Apps script function. Okay, so that looks good. That looks good. So now let's save this just so we don't get it reset. So now let's go back to our Google Apps script side and start talking about some stuff. So this is going to receive data, and we can call this data, let's just call it number, because that's what it's receiving, is the number. And what we're going to want to do is essentially come up and look at our employee data. So this field right here, and we have that, I believe, stored in a global variable, and it is this sheet variable. So we need to call that sheet. So let's just grab that sheet here, and let's simply get the range. And our range is going to be starting at 2-1. And what we're going to want to do in this sheet is get the last row. And since we're starting at this -1, we would like it to not include that empty row at the bottom. Or since we're starting here at this 2, it's actually below that header. So we're going to have to do -1, because if not, it's just going to populate that empty row, and we don't want that. And then we're starting at column 1, so we don't need to subtract this, but we do want to get last column. And then let's get the values of this. Like so. We'll save this, and then now that we saved it, we'll be able to, actually, let's store this in a variable so we can see it. So let imp full data, there we go, equal that. And now let's go ahead and log this out and see what we get. All right, so let's go ahead. Oh, not do get. Yep, you can't get that because we don't have another parameter in there. Okay, pull record, here we go. So let's run that. And as you can see, it's truncated just because it's going to go on and on and on. But it's starting here at the second row. And those second rows in our example has the first 2 columns empty, and that is the date timestamp in our email. So we'll fix that. But you'll see it's coming to us as a 2-dimensional array. And our 2-dimensional array can work with index of. So let's play around with index of here. Let's kind of explain what index of is. Let's create a variable, just do a test variable, it'll be fine. And let's have this variable equal to just simply an array. And let's do a series of names. And we'll do one more here. Okay. So we have a series of names. And say we want to go through this series of names and find out if there's a name within that array. Say we want to see if this array contains, Barb. So to do that, we would use index of. So how we would write this would be, we would want to grab our test variable. So let's put this in a variable so we can log it out. Let's just call this test index. So we want to grab our test variable because this contains the array. And then we want to use a built-in method here called index of. And as you can see, there's a couple options here. Includes find index, last index of. So if you have repeated information and you just want to find the last occurrence of that, like if you're doing bill pay or something like that, you want to find the last time somebody paid you money, you could use last index of. But right now we're wanting index of. And the index of will want a value in the form of a string. So now this is important. Notice that it wants a value in the form of a string, not a number, not anything like that, because if you try to pass it over in a different format, you may get a -1. So you'll see that if that value exists, it's going to return the number index of that value. If it doesn't exist or it's not finding it, it will always return this -1. So we already have, in our example, we already have a number. So this will contain the value that we're trying to search, but right here we don't. So let's just search for Barb, in the form of a string. So now let's log this out. Test. And let's go ahead and get rid of this imp data here because that's just going to take up time. And we're not logging out test, we're logging out the test index. Now, this test index is not going to actually return the value of it. It's going to tell us what index Barb is sitting at. So now let's go ahead and run this. And you'll see the index of Barb is 2. So 0, 1, 2. And if we did Jane, we would get 3. And if we did Billy, we ran it, we would get -1.0, like this. So this is important because what we can do is check this with an if statement. And our if statement, we can then state that if it is greater than, if this test index is greater than -1, which means it found it, what we would like to return would be the entire employee full data set at that test index. So let's go ahead and actually write this how we would like to get it returned. And I'm not going to send it back over to our HTML code yet. I'm just going to take, this is what I'll do. I will just take this and erase this, and then we will let this test thing equal our value for our employee number. So let's go ahead and delete this, delete this, delete this. So we have our employee full data. Now, in order to actually get our employee ID, we are going to have to map this employee full data set and pull out only those IDs there. So to do that, we're going to need to grab our that sheet and then map it based on a specific row ID. So let's create another variable here specifically to house that array of employee IDs, and let's just call this imp IDs. Let's call it rec imp ID array. There we go. And this is going to be sheet.map. And what our map is going to do is, of course, it's going to take a callback function. We'll use our arrow function notation, and let's just call it row. So it's going to be the row arrow function. And what we're going to want to return from this is a row at a specific index. So let's find out what index our employee number is at. So it's at 0, 1, 2. So we need to return the second index. So we can simply put row at second index. So now what this is going to do is it's going to go through, not our sheet, my apologies. We're not trying to pull the sheet, we're trying to pull the employee full data. There you go. So it's going to go through this employee full data set, that two-dimensional array we received, and then it's going to, for every line, it's going to go through and pull out the value at the second element and then return it. So let's go ahead and now log out our rec imp ID and see what we got. Rec imp ID array. There we go. So now let's run this. And what we should have here is, as you'll see, null, 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 null. And this null, 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 null means that it's returning an array, but it's not returning, it's not pulling it correctly. And the reason it's not pulling it correctly is because I made a typo. So with map, and I tend to do this all the time, unfortunately, with map, it's already calling a callback function here, and we're using our arrow notation, so we don't need the squirrely brackets, those little curly things. So now let's go back and make sure that our employee number is also formatted correctly. So we want it formatted to plain text. So now when we come back here and run this, now that I got the syntax down correctly, and log it out, we'll be able to pull all of our values here. Now, looking at this, you'll see that some of our pieces are empty, and these are the ones that we created when we were running our testing our create record. We didn't put the employee number in here, so these are blank. But what we could do to make this, easier, is we can simply come up here and grab this, and then a trick with Google is we can carry that on. So now when we come back here and run it, we'll have a one-dimensional array of only our values. So now what we can do is actually run an index of on a employee number. So let's create ourselves a variable that actually makes sense. And let's just call this imp num index. And this imp num index is going to equal the rec imp ID array index of, because this array here contains all of our employee numbers, and the index of, and instead of passing this number, we'll eventually put the number in here, but for now we will just put 15. So let's get rid of that. We won't need that. Do it in a different way. And then what we can do is log that imp num index. So now let's run this. And you'll see it's 14. And if you count starting at 0 all the way over here to this number, that would be 14. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, hold on. 0. Yep. There you go. It's at the index 14 because it's 15. Yep. So there you go. Good. So now we have that. Now if we were to put, say, no, 51 is still there. Let's do 581 and hit run. It'll come back with a -1 because it just doesn't exist. It's not finding it in that. So let's go ahead and now build out our if statement. And we'll leave this 581 in here for now. We'll come down here and we'll get rid of these logs. No, we'll leave the logs here so we pull the data. And we want to run an if statement stating if imp num index is greater than -1. So the result from an index of is going to be a number, not a string. So keep that in mind. It's not going to return the string -1. It's going to return the number -1. And we don't need the 0. At least I don't think it matters. And what we want to do is we want to return, but for now, we're not going to return it. We are going to just put it in a test index. And what we're wanting to return is the employee data, which is our full range of data, imp full data at that imp num index. So if it finds the index, it's then going to use that index to go to our employee full data, which is essentially our rows, and pull that whole thing. And if it doesn't find it, that else, we can actually return not found. So now let's log out this test variable to see what we have, and let's use 581. So let's save it. Now 581 is going to return -1. And since it's going to return -1, it's not actually going to send us anywhere. And we should get -1. Now the reason why this is not being returned is, let's see, this logger is there we go. There you go, -1. Now let's give it something that it knows. So let's give it 5. And then when we run this, you'll see that we have our first logger, and we found the index at 4, and it returned the entire line of data at index number 4. So let's go back and look at this index number 5 and make sure that it's pulling the correct data. Employee number 5, which is index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, marketing 5. Let's find 1595, make sure that's in there. You'll see 1595. Now these dates you'll see are kind of annoying. So we will have to do some formatting to our dates. And everything else looks good. This empty one here is our notes. So good. So now we have the functionality built to search in an array, a two-dimensional array based on a value. In our case, it's going to be an employee number, and then return it if that employee number is found. Now, instead of this -5 or this string 5, we want to essentially pull this variable that we're sending over, which this is our employee number that was entered from the sheet. So instead of that, we would simply put num here. And we don't have a num because we're not running this from that code yet. But we could also return, instead of this let test, we simply return this value, and then that will be what goes to our HTML side. So I'm going to break up this video into two segments. So I'm going to end this video here. And then the next video, that part 2, is we will then get this data sent back over to our server side or our client side, and then begin populating it within each individual field. So please tune into that next series or that next video in our series, and we will populate this stuff. So until next time, please take care.